Storm of Progress brings together 120 works from our permanent collection, made by 64 artists, so there's a real range of artists even within that number. And it's a really great reflection of the kind of depth and breadth of our collection. By focusing exclusively on German art, and especially on art since 1800, it really gave us the opportunity to look at some objects that maybe wouldn't fit in another type of exhibition.
Böcklin was Swiss, but he worked much of his life in Munich. Munich was a real center for German art in the 19th century. Böcklin was fascinated by mythological subjects. This is another kind of important theme of 19th century German art. A lot of German artists looked to Greek and Roman art and tried to appropriate it in terms of developing native German tradition. Munich at the time was described as a new Athens, and if you go to Munich, you can see a lot of the architecture today is based on classical architecture. The decorative arts, which you'll see interspersed throughout the show, are actually, I feel, a really important part of the exhibition. One example of that in this space is a wine service by Joseph Maria Olbrich. And this connects to the idea of nature because the decanter actually mimics the shape of a peacock. This work has a really interesting connection to St. Louis because Joseph Maria Olbrich actually put together a number of rooms for the 1904 World's Fair here in St. Louis, and an example of this wine service was actually shown in one of those rooms.
One of the great opportunities afforded by the exhibition is a chance to see Beckmann's stylistic transformation as a result of his experience in World War I. We have his painting Grey Day at the Sea. You have these gorgeous frothy waves, and you can almost feel the coldness of the scene. But he's captured so effectively the dynamism of the waves, their constant motion, the way they hit the beach in waves one after another. If you take this Grey Day at the Sea and then compare it to Christ in the Center, what you see is this incredible flatness, and in some ways the economy of the means that he's using after World War I. You see the highly abstracted figures, you see the very kind of washed out palette, and a sort of a thinness that only barely covers the sort of pain and feelings that he experienced. Beckmann was eager to be involved in war, but unlike some of the other artists in the exhibition, he was not eager to fight in war, so he volunteered as a medical orderly, which meant he was a stretcher bearer. The experience of caring for these soldiers, also of handling their bodies, caused Beckmann to have a mental breakdown and a physical breakdown. And while he was recovering, he started to paint again. So when you see the pale body of Christ, when you see the sort of contorted figures, they look like this awkward kind of poses of dead. So one figure that's really important is Käthe Kollwitz, and she's represented in our exhibition with an absolutely fantastic print called Bread. It's very heart-rending because it shows a woman, a mother, with two children at her skirts. And beneath, in very large letters, there's this word written Brot. That means bread in German. And you can tell from the sort of anguish expression on the children's face, these are starving children. You know, the print was made in 1924, the war is over. But here's Käthe Kollwitz making this print about a mother who's unable to feed her children, not even bread. And she was very motivated in her art to highlight humanitarian kind of needs in society. Her husband was a doctor, and she writes in her diaries about seeing a procession of impoverished mothers and children coming to her husband's doctor's office to seek help, and that really what they needed was food. Starvation was at the root of all of the suffering in kind of urban Germany at that time. The war has ended in 1919. Why is child starvation such a problem? And it's because at that moment, Germany was still recovering from the worst hyperinflation in history. Germany was literally in a situation where you would be paid in the morning and your salary would be worth literally nothing. And through a series of financial maneuvers, the currency was stabilized. But by 1924, the kind of poorest members of society were still suffering from the delayed after effects of this incredible hyperinflation.
So the painting that we chose in the section Trauma and Memory is a painting called White Woman. Georg Baselitz become really iconic in terms of post-war German art. And one of the reasons he's become so iconic is because starting in 1969, he takes his painted subject matter and literally paints it upside down. And here he's taken a source image from a German magazine called Der Sturm of a Russian woman who had been a former prisoner of war during Nazi Germany, but in the photo taken right after the war, she was actually leading the efforts to clean up the city. And so it was the shift of a former prisoner of war suddenly becoming a victor in the post-war aftermath. So for a second, you don't really know what you're looking at. You think it's possibly an abstracted field, but then you sort of see a head or an arm or feet. But because it's upside down, it takes a minute for you to really put together as a viewer what you're looking at. And for him, it was this dual dislocation. Abstraction kind of became ideologically compatible with those ideas because it had also been demonized by the Nazi regime through the degenerate art movement.
There's actually a really interesting story behind this painting. It almost looks like an abstraction with these horizontal brushstrokes of white and gray and black. But when you look at it carefully, it starts to sort of congeal into this image of post-war apartment buildings. They call them Plattenbau. They're these apartment buildings that are made from prefabricated blocks of concrete, but also looking back to a long history of geometric modernist building in German architecture. It sort of blurs this line between abstraction and visibly recognizable imagery, which is sort of an important theme or important connection in Richter's work. And it has an interesting backstory in that it's actually based on a photograph of a building model. So it also connects to Richter's longstanding interest in these distinctions between painting and photography.
So one of the absolute hidden gems of the St. Louis Art Museum collection is a Polka painting called The Computer Moves In. This was one of Polka's cloth paintings, which he did throughout his career, where he'd take a found piece of cloth and stretch it over canvas stretchers instead of white canvas. And then what he did often was he used found source images. So here he's taken an image that was the cover of Time magazine in 1980, when Time announced that the person of the year was the computer. The computer really breaking on the scene is becoming something that was understandable to everybody in their daily existence. It's also 1980, so it's the height of the Cold War. And here Polka's playing off of both that Cold War tension of emerging and progressive technology and this idea of art and the digitization of art and computers within art. It actually shimmers, and it's almost mimicking like the glare on a computer screen or a television screen to kind of give you that impression that you're almost seeing this painting as if it's mediated by that technology.
One major work is Isa Genskin's World Receiver. It's a block of concrete with a radio antenna coming out the top, almost like a feeler to kind of pick up on ideas or communications that might be sort of floating around. The antenna is a really important theme in her work, of sort of receptivity to new ideas. But when it's taken within the German context and around the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Genskin started making this series, it also speaks to these very specifically German connections and ideas. For example, the material of concrete is directly related to building histories in Germany, especially in the post-war period, prefabricated buildings. But it also could reference, the Berlin Wall. This material of concrete was incredibly evocative, and the antenna that comes out references these ideas of communication. How do you communicate across borders? How do you make yourself heard from, within a block of concrete? So these are all ideas that Genskin touches on in the work in a way that's open to many different kinds of interpretation.
I'd always wanted to acquire a painting by Gabriele Munter. We have a wonderful collection of German Expressionist painting, but we didn't have a Munter. I sort of visited the places where she painted, and eventually we found this painting, which was perfect. It was from a great date, from 1908. It's fulfilled a really important gap in our collection of German expressionist work. I love the color, the flatness, the kind of abstraction to it, and the way that the more you look at it, the more you see. If you look very carefully, you can see some nuns kind of wandering through the background that you don't see when you first look at the painting. She has a direct connection to St. Louis, which a lot of people don't realize. So she had American relatives, and she came to St. Louis in 1900. She spent a couple of months here. There are some wonderful photographs of her actually in St. Louis. So that kind of just made it even more important to me, to acquire a painting by her. We only acquired it last year, and this exhibition is actually going to be its premiere.